Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Terry, the event manager for Renaissance and GL Education. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping before we start so you can see. While we wait for a few more people to join us, we will be starting at past. But just while we're waiting for those people, please do take a look at the screen while we share some housekeeping. So today you'll notice that you've been muted on arrival, so we cannot hear you, but you will be using other interactivity today, which I'll touch on shortly. If you do have any issues audio, you can use the audio settings. And as I mentioned, this event will be recorded today, so you'll be able to see the recording in the coming days. We will be using some interactivity today, so there is a Q&A bot, so I can encourage everyone to ask any questions in the Q&A bots. Just so we can monitor the questions coming through, please do use the Q&A to ask any questions to our team, and we'll catch on those at the end. We are expecting a higher number of people today, so we'll try our best to get through as many questions as possible, but please do just pop those questions in the Q&A. You can also say hello and anything else in the chat function. So please use the chat function for anything else. Tell us where you're joining us from today. Pop that in the chat and make sure that you change it to everyone. So at the moment, it will default to hosts and panelists. But in the to section, there's a drop down. If you change that to everyone, you can see everyone's message. As I mentioned, for those that are just joining us today, you will be muted on arrival and we will be starting at past. I just wanted to share a couple of events that we are going to be running in the UAE over the coming months and weeks. So I've just popped them on the screen. You can also scan that QR code and that will take you to those events where you can have a look at more detail and register for those. I will reshare this at the end, so don't worry if you don't capture this now, but do take a look at those when you have a moment. And I will be asking at the end if you can complete this survey, so if you want to scan that QR code, you can. This survey will also pop up at the end of the session, so when you close down, it will pop up. So do tell us where, do complete that survey for us. It helps us just to make improvements where needed. Your feedback is valuable to us, so do share that information, and I've just popped the QR code there. But as I said, that survey will pop up at the end as well. And also, if you do forget to ask any questions, there is an email address you can use there, and you can also access our website for more information and future events. So that website is just shown right there. For those just joining us now, just a reminder to make sure that any queries are in chat. If you do have a question for our colleagues today, you can use the Q&A function. Do pop in chat where you're joining us from today. I'm sure some of you might have been at last week's session as well, but do tell us where you're joining us from today. It'd be lovely to hear from you. You will be muted on arrival, as I mentioned already. And this event will be recorded and the presentation can be sent after today's and will be sent via email in the next day or two. As I mentioned, we are using the Q&A functions today, so please do tell us where you're joining from in chat and make sure it's defaulted to everyone. At the moment, it will direct you to hosts and panelists, but do change that to everyone so we can all see your message. And the Q&A is for anything else, any sort of questions you have. We will be picking on those at the end of today's session. As I mentioned already, we are doing some events in the UAE, so do take a look at those when you've got a moment. They are also on our website under events, so you can access them there or you can scan the QR code. And just a reminder, please do give us some feedback. The survey will pop up at the end, but there's also a QR code there for you should you wish to participate in that. I can see we've got lots of people joining us today. I can see people from Rachel from St Mary's High, lovely to meet you. Rosal, Mary from International Indian School, lovely to meet you. Kriston, the Philippine School, Dubai, lovely, hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be starting just a couple of minutes, in about 2 minutes' time. Before I do that, I'm just quickly share these links just in case you need them. Do pop on our website. These details are on our website. You can look at all future events and more information about any of our products on there too. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can get my colleague to start sharing their screen. We do still have a couple of minutes before we are due to start, and I will be handing over to Ginette just in a few moments' time. But do tell us, as I said, where you're joining us from in chat today. We'd love to hear from you. And just make sure that your to setting is changed to everyone. It will automatically default to hosts and panelists. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter for today, Ginette Moore. Ginette, you're muted.
It's like getting the warning on the screen. You're like, you try not to get in the way and then you forget when you actually need to be on there. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I'm usually more professional than that, I promise. I'm so glad that you could make it this afternoon. As I know, as somebody who's based in the school myself, how very, very busy it is, and especially at this time of the afternoon. Perhaps your students have just gone home. There's lots of things you could be doing, so I appreciate you making the time. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about meeting needs and measuring progress and how we can use standardized data to support us with children with additional learning needs. I can see from the chat, you're from all over the UAE. So we've got people here from Dubai, Sharjah and Abu Dhabi amongst those I've seen so far. Polly and I will introduce ourselves properly in a moment. You've already heard all of the housekeeping stuff, so hopefully we're ready to get straight on. So today your speakers are myself, Ginette Moore. I'm the Assistant Principal for Inclusion at Cranleigh Abu Dhabi. I've been here for about 18 months as an inclusion leader. And it's a very interesting and a very challenging role. We have a large site. We have about 2,300 students now across 2 sites. And around 10% of our children have additional learning needs. And one of the things we seem to specialize in is the number of children who are twice exceptional. So we have some very, very able children who also have additional learning needs. We are very proud to have recently been awarded the Centre of Excellence by the Inclusion Quality Mark team. We had our assessment in May and are one of many UAE schools who picked up our award last week. And previous to this, I worked in the ADEC Students of Determination office for about a couple of years and worked on the ADEC inclusion policy and have a 25-year background of education, of which around 10 of that is in inclusive education. So it's something I've become really passionate about. My focus is always on equitable access to education for all learners. And I'm going to carry on screen sharing, but give Polly the chance to introduce herself as well.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. So my name is Polly and I'm an education advisor with Renaissance. I've been with Renaissance for just coming up to 3 years, but prior to that I was an inclusion lead myself over in the UK, hence the very woolly jumper today as we're entering autumn and winter, so very chilly over here in the UK. But yes, I worked in both the state and independent sector over here in the UK as an assistant head teacher and Senko, and worked in both the state and independent sectors. So I've come with a little bit of experience this afternoon. So if you do have any questions, then please do pop them in that Q&A box and I will do my best to answer them. But there may be some more suitable to Ginette as well. So we'll do our best to get through those questions, but hope you enjoy it this afternoon.
Thank you, Polly. So in today's session, this is what we're going to cover. So we're looking at how assessment tools reveal both learning needs and growth for students with additional learning needs. We're going to talk about how data supports us to plan and meet the needs of our students, how it guides reviews, and the next steps. We'll also consider how our local context and other similar contexts internationally impact our decision making. And if ALN is a term you're unfamiliar with, I'll be explaining how it's used on the next slide, so don't worry about that. So who are students with additional learning needs? So you're going to hear lots of different ways in your work and perhaps in press and the sort of research that you do about ways that we describe children with additional learning needs and adults too, and those with disabilities. So most commonly you'll hear special educational needs, SEN, people or students with determination, sometimes additional educational needs. There's no right way, there's no best word. Some of them are also quite contentious. You know, people have their own way of identifying and describing themselves. But for today's session, I'm going to use the term additional learning needs as it's the one that I use every day in my context in Abu Dhabi. And I feel it doesn't have the negative connotations that sometimes special has begun to have when it's used in relation to this group, as we're all human and difference and uniqueness is in itself normal. So as you can see from the definition here, additional learning needs describes those children who need additional support, modification, or accommodations at school. This could be due to a lifelong condition, such as autism or a sensory impairment. It could be a short-term learning need, such as a speech and language delay that improves over time in response to therapy. And before we move on, I'd just like to draw your attention to the first image on the slide. If you're aware of the sunflower lanyard for hidden disabilities, you can actually get a Lego figure that's got a sunflower lanyard on. So I just wanted to put that there because I can't put an image up of a child with a hidden disability because you're not going to know. They don't necessarily look different exactly for that reason. So here you go. Here's our little Lego figure with a sunflower lanyard on. So today we're thinking about how we're using data, but also taking a strengths-based approach. So we could fall into the trap of thinking about a child's limitations, their perceived lack of ability when we look at their assessment data. But rather what we're actually seeing is a picture of attainment and not ability. When we plan to meet their needs, we take into account their own goals and their own interests, and not just what we know about them from assessments. We build a picture of their unique profile of strengths and challenges, and that helps us to determine their support requirements and to create an intervention and support program with the child themselves. Because it's not just about us, is it? It's not about what we know, it's about what's important to them as well. So why does assessment matter? It plays a crucial role in understanding and supporting the learning journey of every child, and especially those with additional learning needs. Traditional assessment methods can often focus on measuring a child's performance against standard norms, such as, the standard age scores, the stay-nines, the percentiles. And while these can be useful, they're giving us a broad picture of where a learner stands in relation to their peers. Inclusive assessment takes us a step further. It helps us to identify individual needs and barriers to learning that might not be visible through traditional data alone. When used thoughtfully, both types of assessment, the traditional assessment and the inclusive assessment, can support us in tracking growth over time. And most importantly, assessment outcomes should not just highlight areas of challenge, they also reveal each learner's unique potential. And this dual focus helps us to plan more effectively, and then we can set appropriate targets and tailor our support to each child's needs. I'm going to be talking about how that's used in practice. Some of you, especially if you've worked in the UK context or in a British curriculum school, might be familiar with the PDR cycle. I do get the P and the D the wrong way around sometimes. It's the assess, plan, do and review cycle. This is something that you'll find in the UK Code of Practice for children with special educational needs. It's actually a practice that most of us do, whatever context we're working in and whatever curriculum you're working with. So that cycle of assessment is, before we can begin to plan, support or interventions, we need a clear picture of what the learner can already do, as well as the barriers that might be affecting their progress. So that's the assess section. That initial assessment feeds into the development of their SMART goals. And I'm sure you're familiar with that acronym, but just in case: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But the assessment doesn't stop there. It's not just something we do at the beginning. Ongoing monitoring throughout that cycle helps us to see what's working and what's not, and whether progress is being made. And if it isn't, then these assessments, insights, are what guide us in escalating support or adapting what we're doing or seeking additional input. Because sometimes, with the best will in the world, everything that we put into place doesn't always have the impact that we want it to have. So that meaningful assessment in this cycle makes the entire cycle purposeful and more responsive. So let's have a look at how we're using data, not just for tracking progress, but to guide decision-making around support. You might be familiar with the image on the screen. It depends which emirate you're in. So for some teachers, you might be thinking, yes, that's something that we absolutely already use in our school. It might be something that you use slightly different language. And again, it's not that there's one way of doing things. This is the Abu Dhabi tiered model of support. It's absolutely okay if you're using something different in your setting, but I'll talk through how this kind of model can help all of us. So our assessment data is going to help us to answer some key questions. What kind of support does the learner need? When is the right time to intervene? And how much support is enough? So the tiered model helps us to match the provision to the needs of the learner, whether that's the universal strategies for all, the targeted interventions for some learners, or intensive individualized support. And because student needs can change over time, data helps us respond with the right level of support at the right moment. Now, if you're not familiar with this kind of model, I'll just explain a little bit more for you. So we have tier 1 as the universal. So if a child has an identified need, it doesn't have to be one that's been diagnosed, but one that we've identified in school, but we recognize that with the right accommodations and modifications in place in the classroom, that child doesn't currently need any additional interventions or support away from the class. They perhaps don't need an inclusion assistant or a TA providing extra support in class, or if they do, it's no more than other children in the class are also having. Our tier 2 children are those who we recognize that tier 1 level of support is not enough. So they're also having interventions, either by having an assistant come into class to work with them, or by coming out of class on a pull-out model to have a targeted support through an intervention which is being evaluated. You'll recognize the triangle. It's because most of our children are not going to fall in this final category of tier 3. So a small number of children require intensive and individualized support. That could mean that they've got a one-to-one assistant working with them in school. It could also mean that they're accessing a different curriculum pathway rather than that which other students are working on. When we use the data that we've got around our students, alongside universal design for learning and adaptive teaching, we can design classrooms that are proactive, flexible, and inclusive. So are meeting a wide range of needs before they become barriers. So for example, that might be by putting that in place, that tier 1 is the right level of support for those students. I'm going to share an example of how we've applied this in our setting here at Cranleigh. So a few weeks ago, our senior management team and heads of department got together with our assistant principal for data and assessment, and myself as assistant principal for inclusion, and our prep and senior inclusion leads. We sat down with access to the data from the GL progress tests that were taken at the end of term 3. Each prep head of year and senior head of department had time to go through that data and to work with colleagues where needed in order to identify students who needed additional support and those who were ready for additional challenge. Now, sometimes we weren't surprised by that data. For example, a year 2 child with a known literacy difficulties performed poorly on the English test, and we already knew that that child was at the early stages of acquiring those literacy skills. For others, we might find that we've got surprising results for children who are not already known to us and not already on our register of children with learning needs. And maybe those test results have come out well below expected levels. So that gives us an opportunity to explore the reasons for this with their class and subject teachers. Now, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, how did they get on in that test? And it might be that they didn't access it effectively because they weren't feeling very well, because they were very nervous. Maybe they had a fallout with friends just before they did the test, and that's what's on their mind, and they're not able to focus as well. So it's not always that they did the test and it really is a very, very accurate representation. We have to look at that bigger picture. So using the test data in conjunction with other information about the learner helps us ensure that our students are getting the right support at the right time. So here's an example of how assessment data can directly inform effective support for an individual learner. This year 5 student joined our school with a known history of spelling difficulties, which was flagged through an initial admissions assessment. So first thing we needed to do, the assess part of that cycle we looked at earlier, is establish a clear baseline. So we carried out a spelling test early in the first term. And this showed a spelling age that was 2 years below the chronological age and marked difficulties in phonological awareness. Based on this data, we implemented a twice-weekly targeted spelling intervention. And this was further supported by regular access to the NESI reading and spelling program, which the student could do both at school and at home online. And that reinforces learning in a multisensory and very engaging way. By the end of term 1, this student had made a measurable gain of 9 months in their spelling ability, and it was clear evidence of how responsive data-informed intervention was able to accelerate their progress. So it shows how the right support delivered at the right time can significantly improve outcomes for students. Like me, you're working in schools where learners come from very, very different backgrounds and have different experiences. Often they've come to us from other schools, but more often we find, certainly in our context, they've come to us from other countries. It's not unusual for children to land in Abu Dhabi on Thursday or Friday and come into school on Monday before they've got a home sorted, before they've unpacked their suitcase properly, before they feel settled. Quite often then they're coming into school and being asked to do tests, and we're seeking to establish a baseline, and they're still becoming very familiar with the UAE context, and also in our context with the British curriculum. Sometimes, although it's very heavily adapted for our local UAE context, and especially with the national identity framework that runs through it, we can find that it can be quite unfamiliar to them. So here we're going to explore further how our standardized testing impacts what we can find out about multilingual and additional learning needs learners. So particularly with neurodivergent learners and these VAL or multilingual learners, we need to be mindful of how they access and interpret assessment tasks. Standardized tests often rely really heavily on contextual vocabulary, cultural references, or assumed background knowledge that might disadvantage these students regardless of their true ability or understanding. And because they're standardised, the difficulty can be that even if you're sort of invigilating and supporting children in accessing a test, you can't actually explain the vocabulary to them. And one of the ones that always stands out to me is, I think it was a year 3 reading test. And it kept talking about pigeons. They're kind of okay, they sort of understood what pigeons were, but the context was very much around a sort of an English, what we would call a high street, you know, so rows of shops along both sides of the streets, and the pigeon was going in and out of the shops. And again, if you're familiar with a shopping mall, then the high street was not necessarily a very familiar context. It depends where you live before you lived here. And the other thing that it talked about a lot, because again, you'll notice if you know anybody British, you'll know how much they talk about the weather. The weather came in this quite a lot, and it kept raining, and the pigeons would often go and sit on the roof, and it talked about gutters. And this was in a school I worked in Dubai, and the children are sort of looking at it like that, what's a gutter? And it was really hard for them to answer some of the questions because they couldn't sit that story in a context that they were familiar with. Reasons like that can actually really disadvantage students who just don't have the cultural knowledge or the vocabulary to access the assessments. So that's why it's important to consider alternative assessment approaches that give a more accurate and fair reflection of what each learner knows and what they can do. And in addition, where it's permitted, we need to ensure that exam access arrangements are in place. So it could be for some students, even if these tests aren't timed, it's not about them running out of time, because we can give them more time if that's what they need. But if you've got a class of 22, 25, 30 children to test, putting them all in a room with the headphones on and a laptop isn't necessarily going to get the best out of all of them. And that, again, can impact the validity of the result that you get. So it might be for some children, take, for example, that learner we mentioned earlier in year 2, where the test shows that they weren't great at reading at the moment. That's okay. We couldn't help them with the reading. But if they needed to do a science test, they could have somebody read the questions for them. And then they can demonstrate their knowledge more effectively, because if it's multiple choice and somebody's reading the questions and the answers, they can actually make sure that they pick the answer that reflects their understanding. It could be for some children that they need somebody to write down the answers for them, because they can verbalize it much more effectively than they can write it. It might be for some children that doing an assessment in standardized in a room with other people doesn't give them the movement breaks, the brain breaks that they need to be able to maintain their focus over a longer period of time. So we want to make sure that we put the adaptations in place to reduce or remove that disadvantage. That then all learners have the opportunity to demonstrate their potential. So ultimately, inclusive assessment is about recognizing that difference, removing the barriers, and making sure that every learner is supported in the process. So once you've got that assessment data, we need to make sense of it. And this is where the reports and the digital dashboards can become really helpful. These tools help us to visualize trends and spot patterns and track progress over time. But it's not just about sort of seeing the numbers on the screen, but really understanding what they mean. So the standardized benchmarks, such as the standardized age scores, you can see that in the lower image there. You've got SAS with a number next to it and a mean of 104. That standard age score allow us to compare an individual learner's performance to the norm. And it helps us identify whether their attainment is typical or delayed or advanced for their age. But data alone, again, doesn't tell us the full story. And that's why triangulation is so important. So we're considering alongside the data, the assessment outcomes with other sources of evidence, such as classroom observations, work scrutiny, and the teacher's judgment. When we've got all of these elements aligned, then we've got a more robust and more accurate picture of the learner's strengths and needs. And if they don't align, that happens too, it can highlight areas that need further exploration or a professional discussion. So ultimately, the effective use of data is about the balance between those things, you know, the data that we've got, the context, and the learner themselves. So let's just go over some of our key points from those slides that we've been sharing today. So assessment data is more than just a record of achievement. It's a tool that helps us to respond to learner needs in real time. It shows us not just the areas where a student needs support, but also where they're making progress and where their confidence is growing. The insight that we get from that assessment data should drive our planning, so both for whole class teaching and for targeted interventions. It helps us to pitch learning at the right level, make sure we're offering appropriate challenge and providing the scaffolding where it's needed. And that tailored provision, along with the assessment accommodations if needed, ensures that all learners, including those with additional learning needs, can access not just the curriculum, but also the assessments. So assessment can be a tool for inclusion, for improving our understanding, and thus for improving the outcomes for our learners. So that was all from me for that session. And now I'm going to hand over to Polly, who's going to tell us some more about GL products and how they can support assessment for learners with additional learning needs.
Thank you, Ginette. That was really interesting to hear how actually across the world we've all got that same aim to support our learners with additional needs, whatever they're called across the world. We've all got that same shared goal. So yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about Renaissance and the GL products and how they can be used, like Ginette says, to support you to identify those needs and to add it in as a little bit of the puzzle, I suppose. So when you're looking at the contextual information that Ginette spoke of, that's really important, the teacher judgments, the conversations you have with families, then those assessment data can play a big part in that. So going back to one of the slides that Ginette shared earlier about the assess, plan, do, review cycle, at Renaissance we have the learning loop, which we is designed to fit really neatly with that assess, plan, do, review cycle. So you can see that part of our learning loop is that assessing of students. So our assessments can help you to identify areas of strength for students, where their challenges are, and identify those areas for investigation and what those next steps might be. So once you've got that assessment data, you've contextualized it, you've worked out which students may need which level of support and what type of intervention, you can then start to adapt your teaching. And again, our assessments can really help with those teaching and learning implications for you to tailor any support relevant to the children. And then as it comes around again, you then have the acceleration of learning. So bringing together the assessing, then the data analysis, you can then measure that progress, you can measure the impact of your interventions. So if you wouldn't mind going on, Ginette, then I can talk to you a little bit about the different products that we do have at Renaissance. Many of you may be familiar with our products. You may use all of them, you may use some of them. Others I appreciate may be new to the assessments that we provide. But we have a variety of core assessments. So Ginette shared some data from our progress test series and also the CAP4 assessments, which is the cognitive abilities assessment. And we would class those as our core products that most children would access. So you've got that baseline data. And then once you've got that data, we then do have other products available that you can use to delve a little bit deeper. So we can see for understanding and decoding reading skills, we've got some assessments such as YARC that really dig deep into comprehension of reading. We have COPS and LAS, which again are sort of cognitive profiling tools. So that helps you to delve a little bit deeper into those processing skills, learning a little bit about working memory. So you can see actually where is that barrier coming from. Again, after a CAT4 assessment, for example, you've got COPS and LAS again, but we also have Recall, which is a quicker profiling tool to understand those working memory processes. We also have Exact to support students who may need specialist adaptations for exams. To cover maths, we have a dyscalculia screener, and we also have a dyslexia screener as well. So if there are needs in both of those areas, you can explore those. Now, again, it can be a minefield of where do you start, which assessment do I start with? So we do have the SEND guide. So our SEND guide, as you can see, and there's a little snip on the bottom of the screen there. It's an interactive guide, which you can use. You can filter out different areas of need, different barriers your learners might be facing. And that helps you to identify actually which assessment might be the most appropriate based on that information that you've put in. And then just finally, my job, as I mentioned, is an educational advisor. And if you are feeling overwhelmed with the data, so if you've got lots of assessment products and then you've gone on to use any of the screeners or additional SEND tools, we do offer data consultations, which is where we can meet with you as teachers and practitioners to help you unpick that data, which we look at day in, day out, and we appreciate it's really important for schools to use the data, but it's not something you might be looking at on a daily basis. So we are there to support you with that. There will be a quick poll actually popping up on screen. So if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about our products or wanting further information, if you can just click yes or no, you can see that on screen there. If you'd like to be contacted about SEND support, then please do fill in that poll. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to sort of have a look at that slide on screen and to respond to that poll. We do have a couple of questions, Ginette, but I'll pass back to, I don't know if Terry, you want to say anything before we ask questions, or if I go straight on to the questions.
Just go straight on to the questions, Polly.
Fab. Okay, Ginette, we've had a couple of questions. So some of them I think I can answer, some of them I'll ask you as well. So we've got one question about, do you have any recommendations for either assessments or interventions for those students with EAL needs? Is there anything that you're using specifically in school that you could recommend?
I'm not directly responsible for children with EAL. So you can hear me okay? I've got a bit of an echo now.
Yeah,
is it all right? I'm trying to think what it's called, and it's escaped my head. I know that our EAL teachers do. I know some of the things they refer to are the resources on the British Council website. I think it's called Lingua House, is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking Lingua Hub, but I think it's called Lingua House, which is a subscription site. I know it's something that they have used that's got like really comprehensive resources for EAL learners.
Perfect, thank you. There is also, we as part of Renaissance, we run other webinars for SEND. So we run a webinar called SEND Searchlight, and one of the topics that we've covered in that is the use of the CEFR framework, and it is a common European framework of languages, but actually we've realised we think it probably would be applicable internationally. So that is something that you could refer to if you're trying to unpick EAL and how to support different learners at different levels of English. That is something you could refer to. So it's called the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So a bit of a mouthful, not a very snappy title, but it is shortened to CEFR. So that might be useful.
Yeah, another resource as well that's just popped into my head is the Bell Foundation.
Yeah,
that's Bell, BELL. They've got some excellent resources on their website.
Yeah, so again, something you can adapt internationally as well. We've also got a question about NGRT, so I can answer that one. Is NGRT considered as a screener or diagnostic assessment? NGRT we would class as one of our core products. So something that you would potentially, an assessment you'd potentially use with all your students. The NGRT is an assessment of vocabulary skills and reading comprehension skills, but also phonics as well if a student doesn't score highly enough in one particular section. So that's a useful assessment to get that core data to then analyse and think about where students may need intervention, where they may be struggling. So I hope that's answered that one. And think I'll just check. I believe that's all the questions that have come through. So no further questions for today.
Thank you, Ginette. Thank you, Polly, very much. We are just going to stick around for a couple of minutes. If you do have any further questions, you can pop them in the Q&A. I will just quickly share the survey link. Again, it will pop up shortly in your after you close this session. But do just take a look at the emails on the screen as we speak here, and the survey here. In fact, that's not the correct one. Bear with me a second. Just while I do that, I think my colleague is going to put the survey link in the chat as well. But does anyone have any further questions they'd like to add? Please do pop that in the Q&A. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody that's joined us this afternoon. I know it's a busy time of year, so thank you very much. And if you wouldn't mind completing that survey, we really do appreciate your feedback, and we do take any comments on board. So do pop your feedback there. And I just wanted to remind you of a couple of events we have coming up. We have the Abu Dhabi, Sharjah and Dubai mini workshops, which I've just put on the screen. You can also scan that code, it'll take you to the events page, so you can have a look at those. And then we have a conference in Dubai on the 14th of November, so do check those out. And I will just put the survey back on the screen. Okay, I don't think we've got any further questions. I can't see any. Oh, we do have a question.
We've got one.
Shall I hand that to you, Polly?
Yeah, that's fine. I can take that one. So we've had a question about RAT assessment, which a school uses for understanding barriers, and how is NGRT an alternative to that. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with RAT myself, but what I can say about NGRT is it comes with 2 subtests, so every student will complete 2 subtests. The first subtest is a vocabulary-based subtest, so there's about that. In that section, students complete sentence completion activities. If they score well enough, they then move on to a passage comprehension, where they have a piece of text, and then they're asked different questions about the text, and there's different aspects of comprehension, so retrieval, simple inference, writer's viewpoints. It covers a whole range there. As I mentioned earlier, if a student doesn't score highly enough to go on to that passage comprehension, they will be directed to the phonics, and then there's a phonics assessment. So I'm sorry that I'm not familiar with RAT, but hopefully that's explained about NGRT to you.
I can add in a little bit of context there as well, Polly.
Oh,
it's
perfect.
something I've
Thank
used.
You, Ginette.
Yeah, I've got the CPT3A qualification, which is a certificate of competence in educational testing and exam access arrangements for British curriculum. And so when you've done the first part of that qualification, the CSET, you can then access tools like the RAT. So there are providers of standardised assessments, and I would say that the danger of using something like that, especially if you haven't had the opportunity to do that kind of training first of all, is the interpretation. And I think that's where the GL products come out really strongly, because you're not working on it by yourself and trying to think, okay, well, now the child's finished this, what does it mean and what does it tell me, and what can I do with that? And the standardization is there, but it takes a bit of practice to do the interpretation. So I think being able to use a product like the GL ones, where it's kind of doing a lot of that work for you, and you've got an output that's guiding you already to what do I do with this information? What does it tell me about this student? I think for me, that's a lot more powerful if you haven't had the opportunity to do that kind of training to give you the guidance that you might need to make the most sense and get the best value out of something like that and the other similar tests.
Thank you, Ginette.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've covered all questions. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us. An email will be sent with the recording, the slides, and the survey. So if you don't get a chance now, please do follow up on that. And we hope to see you in our next session. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.